This is a production of Cornell University.
So, greetings everybody. My name's Dean. I've been working with a combination of USDA Ag Research Service and US Geological Survey in the Chesapeake Bay for about 12 years now. Finished my PhD up at Cornell 12 years ago and headed on down and started working on remote sensing of winter cover crops. So I really appreciate this kind of a conference because it allows the folks who've got their fingers in the dirt doing field experiments to interact with kind of the big picture of what's happening in the landscape with implementation trends. And we've been working in a few different states to try to work those things out. So looking forward to the interactions. Have a whole slew of partners working with soil conservation districts. Have a project in New York I'll be talking about, Upper Susquehanna, a project with Sir Deaker in Pennsylvania, and a lot of partnership with Maryland Department of Ag. So I'm going to be showing you some results of remote sensing in those three states. I work for USGS, so whenever you see the disclaimer, it means it hasn't gone through peer review yet. Chesapeake Bay, Brian just gave us a nice look at it. Water quality being the primary issue, and so winter cover crops, although you know how many benefits they have, really from a Chesapeake Bay program perspective, it's nutrient and sediment reduction, right? So provide cover over the soil surface to reduce sediment loss and sequester nitrogen and living biomass to keep it green over the winter and reduce nitrogen losses. And so it's really promoted by a combination of incentives, particularly in Maryland or through NRCS, regulation, for example, highly erodible lands, you can plant a cover crop in order to meet your T factor for your erosion prevention, and through extension. So just good sense farmers talking to each other, working on soil health and economic benefits of winter cover crops. What you see in a state like Maryland, where there are incentivization for different programs, is on-farm performance is highly variable. So going from upper left, which is probably a rye crop planted with dairy manure, getting a nice thick biomass, down to an aerial seeded field that was cost shared by farmers and happened to fail that year. Aerial seeding on a high residue situation with poor rainfall that year got zero biomass. So that's the environment we're working in, and we're trying to take a perspective where combining remote sensing, satellite imagery, airborne imagery of measuring vegetation on the soil surface, combined with collaboration with ongoing extension programs. So knowledge of where the fields are in Maryland, what's going on them, or other data in other states. So we're thinking with this toolkit, we can really start quantifying the environmental benefits of cover crops. One of our main tools is satellite imagery. On the left, you see a Landsat image of the entire eastern shore set within that Talbot County, one of our focus areas, with some smaller imagery spot that I obtained through US Geological Survey. So really every image is a snapshot in time. We tried to collect imagery around December, January, when the crops have gone dormant for the winter, and then again come back in April or so to look at springtime growth before it's terminated in the spring. If you look at the soil surface through a satellite, which sees infrared as well as our visible bands, you can see vegetation pretty clearly. So the bright red here is reflectance in the near infrared. So the redder fields have higher biomass. You can see pine trees here having a high biomass. You can see a bare field, and then various degrees of vegetation cover within the farm landscape. If you take a particular farm, and this is a collaborating farm we work on, then you can start really thinking about crop rotations, and you can think about management. Here in Maryland, we have a lot of center pivot irrigation, so you can see fields chopped up with crop rotations. And then through collaboration, we obtain access to knowledge of what's going on in each field. So this farm has enrolled most of its land in cover crop program. They grow a lot of barley, so any field outlined in yellow is a barley field. So for a particular field, we might know that it's barley planted at 2.5 bushels a hectare using a no-till drill planted on September 14th following corn. So a lot of information about what's going on that field with that cover crop. And then we can put a remote sensing measurement to that and say that management resulted in 670 kilograms per hectare, pounds per acre of biomass, for example, right? And then we do field sampling to back that up. So that's our general strategy. We collaborate with soil conservation districts, make it out to a lot of farms to collect the field sampling data that Brian was talking about, and then try to promote adaptive management, giving information about what's going on the different fields. So I like saying we have two different strategies. In a state like Pennsylvania or New York, where we don't have access to knowledge of what's going on in the particular fields, we use public data sets. So we're using satellite imagery to look at ground cover. We're using the cropland data layer to look at crop type of the previous summer. And then we're combining those to look at, say, what's the ground cover on cornfields in Cayuga County, New York, right? The first work, here's an example back in Talbot of an image that's been shaded with the vegetation index. So brighter colors here is bare fields, darker is more vegetation. We think about thresholding into different biomass categories, looking at really minimum, low, medium, high biomass with corresponding ground cover thresholds. And then we can translate our image of the landscape into looking at where the bare fields, where the high vegetation fields are. Then we combine that with the cropland data layer. If you're not familiar with this, this is a USDA NAS product available 28 till present, and they use imagery analysis to look at crop rotation. So here mainly corn and soybean and wheat fields grown in this county. So by combining those, we can develop, say, a map of all of the corn fields in Talbot County, including the low biomass, medium, and high biomass fields within the county, right? So these are public data sets, just looking at vegetation in the landscape by crop type. And we've developed a tool that will take the 10 top land uses in a county. It'll calculate the area of corn, 6.5% of the county is corn, and then looking at these biomass categories. So 50% of the cornfields have very little biomass, 30%, 28%, a little bit of biomass, so this amount, 13% medium, and 9% high biomass, right? So somewhat arbitrary where we set those cutoff points, but we use calibration data to try to get at some environmental thresholds. You can look at similar patterns for soybeans or for other crops in the watershed. And this is an example, right? So by combining these data sets, we're looking at Talbot County, Maryland. We're looking at 2008 through 2013. From the cropland data layer, we can see that the acres of corn land have stayed fairly stable with a little bump in 2010. We can look at cover crop. This is just number of fields, not acres, sorry. This is number of fields. This is cover crop following corn. It is hectares, sorry. So 55% of cornfields were planted to cover crops under the subsidy program. And you can see between 28 and 2013, that number climbed to 80%, right? So Maryland cover crop subsidies increasing over time, 80% of corn land in this particular county in 2013, higher than 56 that year on cornfields. Probably 56 over all crop types in the field.
Does that relate to the percentage in those different categories of biomass too, or is that?
Well, that's what this bottom graph is all about, right? So this is just the number of fields enrolled in the cover crop program. This is the performance data that goes along with it.
That's pulling all of the time, new adopters and older adopters. They have the same distribution of low, medium, and high biomass.
Haven't looked at that. That's a nice fine distinction of when a farmer got enrolled in the program. And that would be really interesting to see if the farmers learned over time, for example. I've not thought about looking at that. What we can look at is within each of these corn cover crop fields, what's going on. And you can see in 2009, the brown is minimal biomass, the dark green is high biomass. And you can see over this time, we have shifted. This is all cornfields in the county, right? And so as the cover crops have gone up, we've shifted towards a lot more biomass on the field, right? So this is one example of an analysis you can do in a county using this toolkit. I did this for 5 counties in Pennsylvania in collaboration with Stuart Duiker. We published this a couple of years ago, so I'll run through it real quick. But basically, looking at these counties, they had a program called Without Carrot or Stick. So not using incentives, not using regulations, but really just talking to farmers, trying to promote silage cover crops following corn silage harvest. And they were very active in the landscape from 2010 to 12. And so along with Stuart and NIFWIF funding, we started thinking about, well, can we see changes in the landscape as a result of their extension? Looking at the 4 counties, you can see the crop type distribution, and just skipping straight to the results. 4 years, Berks and York County, you can see percentage of bare soil decreased from 75% to around 50% over that same time period. Lancaster and Lebanon have a higher intensity of cover cropping, and bare soil decreasing from 50 to 25% within these counties. So we saw some really clear trends over time. We did say, well, let's make sure this isn't some bad luck with warmer years over time. And so we did look as accumulated growing degrees. By the time our images were collected, fairly stable. Some other analyses also, but really, between 700, 800, 900 growing degrees over these time periods, making us come to the conclusion that this was a real trend, detecting increased cover crop implementation in the landscape. That's Pennsylvania. I'm just giving you a bird's eye view of some of the different research we're doing. So feel free to look that up. 3 counties in New York just did that this summer. So we're in Cayuga County right now. I did analysis for Cayuga last week. It's not in this graphic. But looking at 3 counties in New York, looking at satellite imagery, what we find up here is that it's tough to get good winter imagery. It's either cloudy or it's snowing a lot of the winter. And if we're looking at Landsat imagery, it comes over every 16 days. So what we found best for this analysis was a springtime analysis. Every April, in most years, we would get a clear image. So here's Seneca County. We're down here in Ithaca, and between the lakes is one of the most productive grain areas of the southern tier of New York. You can see crop type distribution, a lot of alfalfa, corn, and soybeans. Looking at the satellite analysis, for example, of the corn land within the county, a lot of corn land. And here is a trend analysis. So a little bit different than our last graph, but the colors are the same. This is corn going from 0 to 100% of corn land. So you can see not a lot of trend over time in these 4 years we're analyzing, going from 73, 60, 76, 80% soil without much vegetation. You see 2009-10 had the most cover crop. Well, I'll say the most vegetation. Could be cover crops, could be weeds, could be something else they're rotating into after corn. All we know is that there's wintertime vegetation following corn. This is a year with warm temperatures and a little high biomass, but no real trends over time. Looking at Delaware County, downstate near the Cannonsville Reservoir, a lot of just little riverbank farms and farms up in the hillsides, not that much corn land. They've been extending cover crop or extending conservation practices for quite a while. And we're seeing a higher percent vegetation on these fields with only 30 to 40% non-vegetated fields following corn land, but no real trends over time here either. As a nuance, the fields down there are very small, and I'm a little worried we're getting mixed pixels with the edge of the fields, and they might not actually have that high adoption. Working with Paul Sarasletti to try to figure that out. 3rd county, Cortland County, a broad distribution of farmland. And again, we had a better series of imagery here, so more years of analysis with clear imagery in April. And you see it bouncing around 66%, 2010, 11, not very good cover crops. 2014-15 was a terrible year for cover crops. Late corn harvest, wet fall, very few farmers able to plant cover crops. And we did see that. So we really are seeing the effect of climate and farming practices on cover crop adoption, not seeing any real trends over time. So unlike Pennsylvania, we're finding some consistent differences between counties where we can think that we can look at kind of the percent of cornfields or other crop type fields that have winter vegetation following their harvest, but not really seeing any clear trends over time. So that's our initial analysis for New York. Haven't written that up yet. So that's what we do in a state where we're working with public data sets. In Maryland, we're working with private data sets. We have the data for all of the cover crop enrollment for the entire state. And Brian was presenting some of the trends from that data set. And then in particular counties, we've worked with agents where they're actually digitizing the field boundaries of where the cover crop fields are, which allow us to analyze the biomass. And they're moving toward doing that for the entire state as part of the grant work that we've done with Maryland. So we're working to an annual remote sensing analysis for the entire state. In the meantime, we're really focusing on Talbot County. You recall I was talking about, field boundaries planted to particular crops. This farmer released this information, which is why I can show it to you, but I wouldn't show it for the rest of the county what was going on, except in aggregate form. But you can see the number of fields planted to cover crops over time, again, increasing over time in Talbot County. And we're able to really look at every field. And I already presented this type of data. The other thing we can get into is really what are the agronomic factors under the subsidy program that are leading towards variable success in cover crops. And you know what they are really from your own knowledge of cover crops. It's planting method, it's previous crop, it's nitrogen, soils, weather, planting date. A lot of these factors add up to determine health of the cover crops, performance of the cover crops. Here's looking at planting date, right? So Brian showed some interesting data. This is a different way of looking at it. This is the number of fields planted within the early, late, mid planting categories. So early is this green line, and that's planted before October 15th. Take home message, the only way you're gonna get more than 15 kilograms of nitrogen in a cover crop is by planting it early. And there's a big peak of late planted fields that really don't have a substantial nitrogen sequestration benefit. So from my point of view, let's give feedback to the farmers to push the planting dates earlier so that we get more environmental benefit from our subsidies. This graph is the accumulated biomass on this axis. So this is about a ton per acre, 1,000 kilograms per hectare. And the gray is growing degrees before December 31st. So if you plant September 1st, you get 100 growing, or whatever, I don't know the number, but you get this many growing degrees, and the growing degrees dwindle over time, right? If you plant November 3rd, very low growing degree accumulation. The green line is the average biomass for every crop in Talbot County planted on that date. And so you see a very tight relationship between planting date, growing degrees, and biomass on January 3rd. January 6th is when this image analysis occurred. Well, you see a little bump here in mid-October. That's, we think, associated with folks who are planting wheat for harvest. So there's a switch of method there to a lot more drilled cover crops at that point. But this is the type of analysis you can get to when you start looking at all the cover crop fields in the county. You can also break it up by other factors. So looking at the differences in species, number of fields enrolled, biomass, and nitrogen content. This is just for 1 year. You look at this over 6 years, you start throwing weathers into the factor. It gets a lot more complicated, and I'm looking forward to Brian's methods to help kind of tease out these related factors in our enrollment data set. You can see difference in nitrogen content related to planting date, and then relating to planting method with, science is proving the obvious. You already know that if you drill and get good seed soil contact, you're going to get better biomass and nitrogen accumulation than if you're broadcasting by and large. But we're looking at this as a census of all of the fields in the county, so it becomes a fairly powerful tool. And then you can translate this again into dollars per pound of nitrogen sequestered. And you can see that early planted rye is a pretty good deal for the taxpayers compared to late planted wheat. And if you think about that nitrogen being recycled back to the field for the farmer, better deal for the farmer as well, right? Then you can balance that out with incentive payments and come out to an average payment per kilogram nitrogen that Brian's showing to be fairly consistent. Yeah.
Just a thought, you said the two goals initially were nitrogen management and sediment
Right.
erosion.
Right.
I'm just wondering if the biomass correlation, isn't as strong as it is nitrogen when you're just trying to keep the soil in place.
Right.
There might be a lot of benefit from just a little biomass. So I just worry that you're selling short some of the later plantings by only looking at them.
It's a good point, Vern. It's a good point. And since we put together these slides, which are a couple years old actually, we've developed a calibration data set for looking at percent ground cover. And the correlation between the remote sensing data and percent ground cover is actually a lot tighter than for biomass. Biomass, you can measure it until it covers the ground and then it saturates. And you can't tell the difference between 500 kilograms of biomass and 3,000 kilograms of biomass. Right? You can tell it up to about 1,000, up to about a ton per acre, you can tell differences, and after that you can't. That's okay, we can measure well through the critical environmental thresholds, and then we can just say there's a lot of biomass. And it's similar with percent ground cover. Between 0% and 80% ground cover, we can distinguish pretty well, and after that we can just say soil's covered. So you're absolutely right, and we'll be focusing on that with more analyses. Just a final kind of conclusions of what we see in the landscape. The very high biomass fields tend to be rye planted on dairy farms, silage crops that are getting in after silage with manure, and so they have bright green cover crop as this called. Is that a great thing? Yes, it's excellent to have a cover crop on a heavily manured field with a long history of nutrient application. Is it a great environmental success? Not really. We've sampled some fields where there's still 100, 200 pounds of residual nitrogen in October. And it's great that cover crop gets half of that, but half of it's still lost to leaching. So there's a time for nutrient management plans to come in combination with cover crops to really solve these problems. So is greener always better? I think there's a happy medium from a nitrogen leaching point of view. We also see a lot of nutrient-limited cover crops, where the cover crop's doing poorly, not because of a late planting or aerial seeding. It could be early planted drilled rye and still do poorly because there's no residual nitrogen in that field. So the cover crop purists might say, well, fertilize it and you get more benefit. We've yet to convince Maryland of that. Is there a lower threshold for cover crop success? Again, yes, you want to achieve a certain amount of biomass by a certain amount of time to have a good environmental benefit, but that nitrogen limitation becomes a kind of a sticking point, and we cannot remote sense the amount of nitrogen in the soil. How do we define success? Successful strategies, I think, fit with the climate and the farming system. So if you're looking at a diverse farming system with good niches for healthy, productive cover crops, that's how we define success. In terms of simple nitrogen, I was just talking about, maybe some critical thresholds for percent of soil coverage. Combination of factors working in the environment, experimentation, innovation, adoption, and then getting back to carrot or stick. I think, a combination of incentive, regulation, and just plain old farm-to-farm transfer, and growing the practice of healthy cover crops is what's going to get us to the environmental endpoints of a lot of healthy cover crops in the landscape. Remote sensing is one tool in the toolbox. It's kind of a broad brush. I can look at a field and say there's green on it. I don't know if it's chickweed or if it's rye or whatever. There's, through collaboration with the farmers, you know more and more what's going on. But we have a good tool here. So if anybody's interested in looking at your county or looking at particular farms, looking at spatial variation in fields, thinking about, year-to-year variability, looking forward to working with the Sustainable Ag Lab folks as they get their cover crop growth models going. I think combining the cover crop growth models with the remote sensing would be a good further development. That's what I got for you.
Any questions for Dean?
So for a few years, we were going out October, December, April in the same field. We were sampling nitrogen in the top foot. And you see a fair amount of residual nitrogen. You see about half of it collected by the cover crop and the other half lost below the top foot. And really by springtime, you've lost all your nitrogen from your top foot through leaching in our environment. Sandy soils, fairly high rainfall in the winter time. You lose the nitrogen out of the surface soil in the field. We've also seen evidence of the cover crops going down and catching that pulse from deeper soil and bringing it up, where the amount of nitrogen in a cover crop in the springtime was more than the amount of nitrogen in the top foot of soil in October. So where did it come from? Came from down farther. So growing into the spring's awesome. I think that the March 1st cutoff date was historic from early organization of the cover crop program to fit all of the farmers' needs without scaring anyone off. And they're basically saying, well, after March 1st, you can do what you want. I think it's up to the extension folks to say, hey, farmers, there's a real soil health benefit from going longer. Maybe you don't need Maryland to pay you to plant longer, to grow it longer. Maybe you just need to do it yourself. There are farmers who talk about rye getting away from them in the spring and not knowing how to kill it. So you guys who are really good at springtime management, I think there's a whole talk about spring management, isn't there? I think that that's something that's developed in the last 5 years with a lot more knowledge, really. So I'm happy to bring that type of information to Maryland. And if we're looking at the springtime, then to look at that. Remote sensing gets tricky in the spring because certain fields get terminated, other fields grow out. And so you really have to, you can't look at the whole landscape. You have to start looking at termination dates and follow fields as they go from green to yellow to brown to planted to green again with the corn. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, my main point is that it's not, yeah, sure, so all is important, but it falls right within the main program.
And there's a lot of mineralization happens in the springtime, and you should have a good cover crop there to get it. Yeah. They're not resisting it. I'm sure they'd be open to that discussion. Look at nitrogen content in the yeah. So USGS, we like calling them unmanned aerial vehicles. Leave the drones to the military, but we've used them a little bit experimentally. I'm based out of Beltsville Ag Research Station, and we're within the DC no-fly boundary, so it becomes difficult. We've done some work on the Eastern Shore. Really, for me, I'm looking at the watershed landscape approach, so I'm sticking to satellites, and the satellites increase in accuracy, then yes, the red edge is very useful for measuring nitrogen content. When we were doing most of this work up to 2013, we were using spot imagery, which only has red, green, blue, near infrared. And so we're not able to measure nitrogen content. Now we can use WorldView 3. We can look at crop residue. I'm not talking about it, but we have a whole project that's looking at crop residue and tillage intensity remote sensing. And then, yeah, you can start measuring the nitrogen, percent nitrogen content of cover crops with sensors, especially with proximal sensors, things that you're flying over the field. Maybe that's where we go with the next 5 years of grant work or something like that. But, yeah. In terms of the biomass saturation, I think that's always going to saturate, but being able to measure the nitrogen content along with the biomass would certainly be helpful. All the farmers, what they want to know is how much nitrogen. And you know that nitrogen content of small grains varies between 1.5% and 5%, depending on stage growth and fertilization. Thanks, everybody. Over the rest of the conference, please, get in touch with me and give me some of your knowledge to add into this. I'd really appreciate it.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.